Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 87, Mrs. Batman. Acknowledgement to Don Bradmore, who wrote the story on Eliza Callaghan for the Female Convict Research Centre, Incorporated, in 2021. The centre is an amazing source of female convict information, and they have given me permission to reference information to help create this episode. Little is known with certainty about Eliza Callaghan's early life, except that she was born at Ennis, County Clare, Ireland, in 1802. In the Australian Dictionary of Biography, she is referred to as a woman of uncertain origins, whose surname was probably Thompson rather than Callaghan. Other sources suggest that she was from a wealthy landowning family, but that in her childhood her father had lost favour with his parents and had fallen upon hard times. Her mother was an elegant, learned and strong lady of exceptional character. From the age of 17, Eliza had been forced to make her own way in the world. She was said to have been beautiful, elegant, fiery and learned. By early 1820, Eliza was in London, where she soon fell into bad company. On the 18th of September in 1820, she and two male accomplices stood trial at the Old Bailey for passing a counterfeit banknote with the intent to defraud the Governor and Bank of England, they well knowing it to be forged. The court was told that on the 10th of June 1820, the prisoners had bought liquor at the Lord Hood Public House in Limehouse and had attempted to pay for it with a £1 note. The publicans, suspecting the note to be counterfeit, had called the police and all three of them were arrested. At that time, they had attempted to destroy a small bundle of similarly forged notes, which they had in their possession. The jury returned a verdict of guilty against all three. Eliza, who had confessed her guilt, did not speak in her own defence. She was sentenced to death, but the sentence was later commuted to transportation for 14 years. After the trial, Eliza was held in jail for almost 12 months in England before being put aboard the convict vessel Providence, sailing from England on the 13th of June 1821 and reaching Hobart on the 18th of December 1821. There, 53 of the women, including Eliza, were disembarked and the remainder were taken to Sydney. The report from the jail in which Eliza had been kept in England before her departure had described her as bad, and as could have been expected perhaps, she was troublesome from the beginnings of her time in Van Dieman's Land. On the 17th of March 1822, just 3 months after her arrival, she was charged with being drunk and disorderly while assigned as a servant to Mr. Petchey of Hobart. She was ordered to spend a week in prison, during which time she was to wear the humiliating iron collar, intended to remind her forcefully that she was a prisoner of the Crown and subject to its laws. In addition, she was to sit in the stocks twice, for a period of 2 hours on both occasions. However, this did not deter Eliza from further misdemeanours. Twice in the following year, while she was assigned to Petchey, she was punished for being absent from her service without permission. On the first occasion, sent to the stocks for another 3-hour session, and on the second occasion for 2 hours a day for a whole week. The iron collar and stocks were cruel and degrading punishments. Fortunately, female prisoners were subjected to them relatively infrequently. A search of the database on the Female Convict Research Centre, which contains approximately 13,500 female convict records, reveals that while some women were subjected to one or the other more than once, the stock was used only on 143 occasions and the iron collar only 64 times. So it seems that Eliza was one of those hardened criminals in their eyes. By 1840, the authorities had recognised that both modes of punishment were utterly inhumane and had discarded them. So in 1824, her master, Petchey, left Van Dieman's Land on a short visit to England, and in his absence she was assigned to Mr. P.A. Musgrave, the Superintendent of Police at Launceston. In early 1825 she absconded from her service with Musgrave and seemed to have vanished completely. On at least 13 occasions throughout that year, from late February 1825 until late November 1825, the following notice appeared in the Hobart Town Gazette and Van Diemen's Land Advertiser. Elizabeth Callaghan, 5'2.5", brown hair, brown eyes, 19 years of age, a servant, tried at London in September 1820, sentenced 14 years, arrived per Providence 1821, native place, County of Clare, absconded from the service of P.A. Musgrave, Esquire, £2 reward. She'd fled to Kingston, and this was the grazing property of John Batman in the foothills of Ben Lomond, a mountain on the northeast of the colony. Batman was a year older than Eliza. It seems that police were suspecting that Batman might have been harbouring Eliza. Soon after Eliza's disappearance, Batman had been accused of hiding her, and the police constable had been sent to search his property. The constable later reported that he'd seen signs that a woman was or had been living there, but he was unable to confirm her identity. Batman was not charged with any offence, and the investigation was dropped. So who was Batman? Well, John Batman is the man that Eliza found refuge with, and he's a well-known name as he was the founder of Melbourne. His parents, William and Mary Batman, and quite often spelt Bateman, had reached Sydney on the Ganges on the 2nd of June 1797. His father, William, was a Middlesex cutler and grinder of Yorkshire background, and he was transported for receiving stolen saltpetre. His wife made her fare and brought with her their children, Maria and Robert. After obtaining his ticket of leave, William Batman established a timber yard at Parramatta. They went on to have 5 sons in total, plus their daughter Maria. John was the second son that was born in 1801, and John was apprenticed as a blacksmith at Sydney in 1816. However, within a few months, his evidence led to his master's execution for burglary. His apprenticeship lapsed, and during the next 5 years, he was a jack-of-all-trades farmer. In December 1821, John Batman and his younger brother Henry moved to Van Diemen's Land, the same time that Eliza had landed on the Providence. John's brother Henry became a wheelwright near Launceston, and John found his footing as a grazier. He leased grazing land near Hobart. And in 1823, he was contracted to supply the government meat stores at Georgetown, and this was a profitable venture for him. So by 1824, he had enough capital to graduate from leasehold to a grant of 600 acres at Kingston. John was described as alert and active, sufficiently literate for any practical purpose, sociable, a fine physique, and a promising bushman. So how did Eliza Callaghan find herself at John Batman's property? There was an account, so it says that Eliza introduced herself to John Batman at his property by saying, "I'm Eliza, the woman bushranger." And there was something about her voice, her pose that touched John Batman. He laughed kindly and incredulously. He said, "You, a bushranger?" He was sympathetic. She answered his questions frankly, the while he studied her closely. The bushman saw that despite her appearance, she looked as wild as the bush that surrounded her. She was beautiful. He noted that she spoke as one who had known culture and education. In answer to his queries, she told him part of her story, that she was an assigned servant and that she had been treated by her employers so badly that her life of an outcast in the wild seemed preferable. She had escaped and turned bushranger, though not thief. John was kindly by nature and very young. He was still only in his 20s, and Batman impulsively assured the girl that she should endure no more of such slavery if he could help it. But what was he to do with her? Had she not encountered him, she must have fallen into the hands of the blacks or the bands of stock-stealing outlaws. But the next move was not so easy to plan. His duty, of course, was to arrest her and return her to the penal authorities for punishment. It was a serious offence in those days to shield a convict, and Batman was virtually a magistrate and a police agent. He'd risen quite high in the area due to being an expert bushman, and this enabled him to rise above the other settlers who had recently emigrated from the British Isles. As they walked along, Eliza related the rest of her story. An excellent penwoman, she had been driven by poverty to forgery, convicted in London and transported to the dreaded Port Arthur. Good conduct had led her to being paroled as an assigned servant, but the change had almost been worse than the prison. Batman took her to his home And Richard Howard in his memoirs relates that Batman hid her in an underground apartment whenever strangers came near the farm. An unhappy love affair had already influenced Batman's life and exiled him from his family in New South Wales and sent him roughing it in Van Diemen's Land. Pain of the old wound disappeared, however, before Eliza's shy charm and pathetic gratitude. Marriage in the circumstances, perhaps even a declaration of love, was out of question, but it is recorded that no man could have been more devoted to his housekeeper than Batman was. So it's quite possible that Eliza was already pregnant to Batman when she fled to the sanctuary of his property in early 1825. Some records state that they met as early as 1823. So Eliza gave birth to a daughter, Maria, late in 1825, and she was to be the first child of 8 that they would have together, 7 daughters and a son. In the following year, 1826, Batman was catapulted to prominence in Van Diemen's Land when he was credited with the capture of a notorious bushranger, Matthew Brady. His role in Brady's capture attracted the attention of influential people, including the Lieutenant Governor, George Arthur, and it had earned him benefit. So John decided to try to secure Eliza's freedom. The old Van Diemen's Land penal laws were so harsh that Batman was at first afraid to appeal. He weighed what possible influence he had with the authorities and asked himself if he was powerful enough to obtain a pardon. If the appeal failed, he would be indirectly responsible for sending Eliza back to prison. Finally, he approached Governor Arthur himself and pleaded for Eliza with all the feeling he could muster. And Governor Arthur did consent to them marrying in 1828. So on the 29th of March 1828, Eliza and John Batman were married in a ceremony conducted by the Reverend James Norman at St John's, Launceston. Interestingly, the parish register shows Eliza's name as Eliza Thompson or Elizabeth Callaghan, both names listed. By that time, Eliza had given birth to 2 more daughters, Lucy in December 1826 and then Eliza in November 1827. By 1835, John Batman's land, Kingston, covered more than 7,000 acres. It had appropriate animals and buildings and had numerous hands, but it was too rugged to be highly productive. Van Diemen's Land was fully grazed, yet it needed more meat for its convict population. With Hamilton Hume and William Hovell's discoveries and the strategic settlement momentarily perched at Western Port, it already led Batman and Gellibrand in January 1827 to apply for a mainland grant proportionate to the worth of the livestock, that is £5,000, that they proposed to depasture there in John Batman's charge. But this application was refused on the grounds of uncertain policy. By now the Henty family had settled in Portland. Have a listen to episode 80 if you haven't already done so on the Henty brothers. It outlines their story into how they had established land in Victoria. So on the 1st of May 1835, Batman made the decision to depart for Port Phillip, and he asked for the draft of a treaty with the Port Phillip natives. On the 15th of May, the press published his intention, and on the 13th of June it announced his triumphant return. In June 1835, the Port Phillip Association took formal shape and was actioned immediately. William Todd, who was an educated Dubliner, 2 other white men and 7 Sydney blacks composed of John Batman's exploring party. With their help, Batman came to practical terms with a section of one of the 2 Aboriginal tribes who respectively occupied the western shores of the Bay and the Yarra Valley to their joint boundary along the Saltwater River. Negotiators and natives met on the Plenty, a minor tributary of the Yarra, 2 days before a boat's crew reached the Melbourne Basin. The press announcement of Batman's return to Launceston mentioned his site for a township at the head of Port Phillip that was well supplied with a running stream of fresh water. He was then the greatest landowner in the world. He claimed the Bellarine Peninsula, where his holding party was camped at Indented Head, and the coastal strip between Geelong and the Yarra, where he had already noted a place for a village. This place for a village was later the township and now the city of Melbourne. On the 18th of June, Batman wrote to Wedge from Kingston that John Pascoe Fawkner had told him he would settle near Point Nepean. As he goes to the opposite side, I think it is all the better for us, the more the better. Wedge and his brother Henry Batman arrived at Indented Head early in August 1835. The Norval was chartered at £300 a month, and made the first of several trips in the November, her captain, Robson Coltish, recorded that Batman, who then accompanied the boat, planned all the fittings, pushed the work on quickly, and showed a perfect knowledge of both the Saltwater River and the Yarra when her boats pulled up at the settlement. During a brief visit, he landed extra hands as well as livestock and weatherboards fit for a house on Batman's Hill, just north of the main settlement on the Yarra River. It was already surrounded by a garden and the beginnings of an orchard. He brought Eliza and his 7 daughters over in April 1836. By the time of their arrival, Eliza had given birth to 4 more daughters: Elizabeth Mary in 1829, Ellen in 1831, Adelaide in 1832, and Palenomena in 1834. Not long before her departure, Eliza might have been well pleased to see her name listed in the Hobart Town Chronicle as the recipient of a free pardon. Their only son, John Charles, was born in the following November. Batman had then improved with buildings, a garden and orchard, and some 20 acres west of the future town boundary. He employed 30 servants and began as the association's official manager, collaborating with Wedge and controlling the incoming flocks. He grazed his treaty block north of the settlement and promoted racial harmony and gave temporary office space to the first police magistrate, William Lonsdale. Miss Caroline Newcombe was the children's governess. She was a refined young woman who, on medical advice, had immigrated to Hobart Town in 1833. She had a library, good sheep, exceptional horses, attractive cattle, a superior house in a splendid situation. John sold Kingston on terms for £10,000, and he ferried his entire livestock, equipment, building materials, and all else he needed to establish himself across the mainland. His barometer seemed high and rising. Other groups soon followed, and within a year of Batman's arrival, the settlement on the Yarra was a bustling hive of activity. But unfortunately, illness disabled him. Although he was fit to ride 48 kilometres through a wild night in June 1835, he was under medical treatment a few weeks later. In July 1836, he was walking with difficulty, and James Backhouse recorded in November 1837 that he had been much of an invalid since his removal. Eventually, Batman became so physically helpless that he needed a rushwork perambulator, so a large pram, I suppose. He was forced to abandon most of his farming activities, and he set himself up as a merchant and opened a general store, and he acted as a middleman between the local graziers and the Van Diemen's Land government for the supply of meat. The tribute depot he established on Batman's Hill became his general store, and it replenished from his schooner, the Gem. He bought 3 allotments at the first Melbourne land auction, 5 allotments at the second that totalled £450, and he built on several of them. Moreover, to keep his various enterprises going, he found it necessary to delegate their operation to paid managers, with great expense, and it made him largely defenceless. He borrowed too much and he lent without security. His once vast empire was crumbling and he was left financially defenceless. As his illness increased, his ambition for his children sharpened. After Miss Newcombe left, he engaged Nicola Ann Cook, a young Vandemonian widow, to care for the girls, and in May 1838 installed her in his house at the northwest corner of Swanston and Flinders Streets at an annual rent of £100, little more than her basic quarterly fee. Eliza had turned for companionship and solace to William Willoughby, Batman's storeman clerk, and was soon in a close relationship with him. When Batman became aware of this, he threatened to cut Eliza and the children from his will. John Batman gave his wife £5 and tried to bar her dower. There can be little doubt that the natural leader of 1835, to whom she was closely linked, lost her affection as a thwarted cripple. She traced his downfall to excessive exposure. Others, though, said it was to grog and venery. John Batman wrote his own letters until at least February 1838. From August, Newton seemed to have acted as a scribe, if not an author. But as late as the 12th of March 1839, Batman's normal signature followed his final plea for the preemptive purchase of Batman's Hill, where he claimed to have spent more than £1,500. In an attempt to ameliorate the situation, perhaps, Eliza decided to get away for a time at his expense, and in February 1839 she sailed alone to England, leaving the children in Melbourne with the governess. Upon her return the following year, Eliza heard that Batman, close to bankruptcy, had passed away on the 6th of May 1839, just 3 months after she had left for England. And it says that Batman only lived 39 years, but before he died, he had accomplished one great undertaking after suffering many rebuffs and vexations and disappointments to be the founder of the state of Victoria. There is no little merit in him who opens up a wilderness to his race and leads thousands to a happy home in a strange land. John Batman's will, dated on the 18th of December 1837 and drafted by Gleadow and Henty, solicitors Launceston, was complicated, rigid and out of date. Most of the real estate devised to Batman's daughters was already sold. His personal assets, which was £5,500, fell £1,000 short of the verified debts, to which claims for more than £4,000 were afterwards added. The executors, in which John listed in his will as "my friends, Lonsdale and Simpson," held themselves powerless to release the 3 remaining allotments, which were rented at £790 and valued in 1842 at £9,000. They soon assigned their task to 2 trustees, P.W. Welsh, a leading Melbourne merchant, and E.T. Newton, an accountant and Batman's manager, at £400 a year. But all 4 were joined as defendants when Anthony Cottrell, as the next friend of Batman's younger girls, took legal proceedings. Also called in defence were separate lawyers, where Batman's son, as heir at law, Batman's eldest daughter Maria, and eventually her second husband Robert Fennell, and Batman's widow Eliza, whose stubborn claim for dower was sustained by her second husband William Willoughby. The case dragged on through Chancery months after Batman's son was drowned in 1845. The costs of the proceedings, £2,299, and the balance of dower, £400, more than absorbed the price, £1,131, obtained for the 2 still saleable allotments. For the next few years, during a long and complicated series of court battles, Eliza, with the help of her husband Willoughby, contested Batman's will, attempting to get possession of whatever remained of his assets, but most of his property he had owned had already been sold off to cover his debts. The cost of the court actions soon absorbed the balance. The girls had received nothing beyond their education, which Welsh, to his credit, maintained until 1842, thus contributing to his own bankruptcy, but enabling the younger girls to take refuge without society embarrassment. And they were taken on by friendly households such as Dr. and Mrs. Alexander Thompson, the Mrs. Drysdale and Newcombe, John Aitken, and their father's former agent, Joseph Griffin of Geelong. Lucy, the second daughter, kept a school. Eliza was an able woman and wrote well, and through her second husband, she secured one of Batman's allotments. To recoup money owed to it, the government had confiscated Batman's Hill. Eliza wrote to Queen Victoria pleading for compensation in recognition of all her husband had done in developing the Port Phillip district, but her appeal was unsuccessful. And there was a recollection of an article written in 1903, and it says, "There is a tragic story of his will. Batman owned property in Melbourne, which, if held by his descendants today, would be worth nearly $1 million. Batman's estate eventually passed out of the hands of his family after his only surviving grandson got out of it £25, being part of the proceeds of a small allotment of a lane in Little Bourke Street." John Batman's exceptional talents brought him from humble beginnings into auspicious prominence. He grasped a chance that many may have seen but no others seized, and initiated a free colony on a basis consistent with the welfare of its Aboriginals. He conjured prosperity and domestic happiness from most unlikely sources and aspired beyond them. Cursed by common failings, he had yet had grand intention and perseverance to back it. He was brave and considerate, capable of bluff, but fundamentally honest. And then suddenly he lost everything. At least one title of land near Finesford, Geelong, still traces back to the grant native chiefs to John Batman. These parchment agreements were in general prepared by Gellibrand, but apparently Todd and Batman added the essential particulars. So you would have heard mention in the case of the will that Eliza married William Willoughby. So in 1841, Eliza married William at St James's Church, Melbourne, and they settled down together at Geelong. However, the marriage proved to not be a happy one, and within 5 years they had parted. Willoughby went to Craigieburn, where he was to die following a stroke in 1856 at Eliza and John Batman's daughter Lucy's home. Undoubtedly contributing to Eliza's unhappiness at the time of the breakdown of this marriage was the tragic death of her much-loved only son, John Charles Batman, who was accidentally drowned. After the marriage breakdown and her son's death, Eliza had become lost. According to one report, she worked as a governess for a time, and on her daughter's marriage certificate, Eliza was listed as Elizabeth Callaghan, governess. Another report suggests she rented a home in Autumn Street, Ashby, which is now Geelong West, at which she used to entertain gentlemen for pleasure. By that time, she was using the name Sarah Willoughby and was described as a woman of somewhat abandoned character. On her eldest daughter's gravestone information, her mother is stated as Sarah Willoughby. Shockingly, however, her life was soon to be cut short. On the 31st of March 1852, she was murdered in her home during an alcohol-fuelled quarrel with acquaintances. Pointing out the murder scene, it was described as horrible an appearance as ever human eyes beheld. And the report on the atrocious killing was, information was given to police this afternoon that the unfortunate woman was found dead in her house at Ashby. They were informed that a disturbance had taken place between the deceased and a woman named Eliza Wilson and 1 or 2 men. Police have apprehended the woman and a man named John Trigg. On searching the woman at the watch house, police found a pound note with fresh bloodstains on it, concealed under her armpit. It caused a great sensation. Other reports mentioned that Eliza had been kicked and beaten to death in what resembled a bar brawl. She was only 49 years of age. Strangely, the man and woman who had been arrested following the discovery of Eliza's body were never brought to trial. In late July 1852, they were discharged by order of a judge on the grounds that they had been in jail for 2 sessions without being tried. In a turn of events that appalled many people at the time, the Crown did not appeal the judge's decision. So on the 1st of July 1852 in the Argus, it outlines this. The discharge of the prisoners John Trigg and Eliza Wilson at the late criminal sessions, charged with the wilful murder of Mrs. Willoughby, is a subject calculated to cause the greatest horror and distrust in the minds of the community, and we may well ask, how can such things be? If Trigg and Wilson were competent to be put up for trial, then why weren't they tried earlier? Why were they not tried when all the witnesses were in attendance? There has been no additional evidence obtained since then to prove their guilt. Says that the Crown were desirous of procuring the third person implicated, a man named George, before they proceeded to trial. So it is very evident, therefore, that the Crown intended at one time to try them. It is incumbent on the Attorney-General to put Trigg and Wilson on their trial and let them be acquitted by a jury fairly and publicly of the foul deed in which they were charged. So nothing ever really came of it, despite public protestations. Eliza's remains lie in an unmarked grave at Geelong Cemetery, and her story is now largely forgotten. Mount Eliza on the Mornington Peninsula in Victoria was named after Eliza Batman in 1836 by Captain William Hobson. John Batman and Eliza's descendants. The first 4 children were all baptised on the 2nd of June 1830 after their parents married in Tasmania. So their firstborn, Maria Batman, she was born on the 5th of September 1824 and the birth was registered in Launceston. She married John McKinnon on the 2nd of February 1841 in Victoria when she was 17. John was a tide waiter, that is a shipping customs inspector, who died on the 3rd of August 1841, so only 6 months after their marriage. She then married Robert Fennell and had 4 children with him, 3 who survived infancy. Robin and Maria went to Ireland in 1850 with their 3rd child Lydia being born at sea. They returned by 1853 as their 4th child was born in Melbourne. On the 20th of May 1853, there was an article in the paper, alleged murder of a wife by her husband. An inquest was held yesterday at the house of John Hyland, Simpsons Road, Richmond, on the body of Mary Hyland, to inquire into the circumstances on which the deceased came by her death. The deceased was 72. Two young women who were in the adjoining house gave evidence that they heard cries from the deceased, which induced one of them to go to the house and threaten John Hyland with bringing a constable unless he ceased beating his wife. They also swore that they heard blows inflicted but did not see any given, and that the deceased had stated that her husband had struck her with a pair of bellows on the jaw, which she thought had been broken by the blow. On these grounds, Mary Ann Carr, the young woman who had threatened to bring the constable on the death of the deceased, gave information to the police, and John Hyland, the husband, was taken into custody on suspicion of having caused the death of his wife. On the other hand, Robert Fennell, Esquire, of Yarra Grange, deposed that the deceased had been for 20 years a nurse in his wife's family, that her husband was very kind to his wife and invariably treated her with the greatest attention, providing her with everything she required in her debilitated state of health, and that Mrs. Fennell was in the habit of visiting her to provide for her wants, and that she found the deceased so sensitive to touch that on one occasion she required to be moved and she would cry out and exclaim that the parties were murdering her. Upon the view of the body, the deceased's jaw presented no marks of violence which would corroborate the statement that she'd been struck by bellows. Bruises appeared on other parts of the body, but they were accounted for by the fact that the old woman, who moved about with a crutch, had met with 2 severe falls owing to her weakness and decrepitude. It also appeared that the deceased, from imbecility of mind, sometimes made statements which had no foundation but in her imagination. It may be added that the deceased and her husband had lived together for 30 years. The jury, without hesitation, delivered a verdict that the deceased had died from natural causes and not from the suspicion attached to John Hyland, her husband. The accused was discharged. So that gave a little bit of an insight into Mrs. Hyland and the fact that she assisted the family, the Batman family, at one point. So Maria died in Collingwood on the 13th of April 1856, and she was only 31. And Robert Fennell's property where they lived was called Yarra Grange Estate, and it was situated on the Yarra River, near where the punt used to be at Studley Park. There was a tradition in some members of the Batman family of burying an iron box that contains considerable jewellery and money somewhere on the estate, and from what can be learnt, the iron box is rusting somewhere beneath the surface of the soil now. The Fennell family consisted of 1 son and 2 daughters, all of whom proceeded to the old country many years ago, where one of the daughters married a well-known brewer named Benjamin Murphy, and who at the time owned Prior Park at Clonmel in Tipperary. So Robert sells up in May 1856 after the death of Maria, and he leaves to go back to Ireland with his 2 daughters in the August of 1856. The second daughter, Lucy Adelaide Batman, was born on the 11th of December 1826 at Kingston. In 1934 there was a mention about Lucy, and she was the daughter that ran a school that was mentioned earlier. There can be no question as Miss Batman having had a school. It was situated at the corner of Williams and Collins Streets, the site of John Batman's house. Lucy married Joseph Lomas in 1852. He was from Craigieburn, and they had a son in 1858 that was registered in 1859, and he was called Charles William Batman Lomas. The child's death is recorded on the 16th of April 1859. By 1861, Lucy and her husband had separated, and she was living in Sydney, and she wanted to sell a property left to her by her father. So in the Insolvent Court on the 1st of August 1861, it says, Mr. Moore moved that leave be granted to Mrs. Lucy Lomas to convey a property in Melbourne without the consent of her husband. There has been a deed of separation between the parties a long time since, and the husband has not since been heard of. And that was postponed at that point. The next day it was reported. Mr. Moore applied on affidavits under Section 89 for Lucy Lomas for an order that the concurrence of Joseph Lomas, husband of Lucy Lomas, in a conveyance of property devised by the late John Batman to Mrs. Lomas should be disposed with. Mrs. Lomas and her husband have separated by mutual consent. Mr. Justice Molesworth was not clear that a person out of the jurisdiction could have benefit of the Act No. 122. He called for the papers in the application and reserved his decision till he could examine them at leisure. So we're unsure whether Lucy did in fact benefit. And there was a recollection of Lucy. It says that she was the beauty of the family. She had a charm and caused many young men's hearts to flutter in Melbourne in the early days. And Lucy moved to California in the US. However, I've been unable to find a firm death date on Lucy. The third daughter, Eliza May Batman, was born at Kingston in Tasmania on the 1st of November 1827. She married William Daniel Collier in Victoria in 1846, and she died in Scotland on the 24th of November 1862. The fourth daughter, Elizabeth Mary Batman, was born on the 25th of September 1829 at Kingston in Tasmania. She married William Weir in 1853 in Geelong. This was William's third marriage, and William Weir was the town clerk for many years in Geelong. And Elizabeth died in January 1864 in North Geelong, aged only 34. They had 5 children. 2 of her children died in 1861 and 1864, being only 2 years old and 1 year old. And their first child died aged only 34, so that left only 2 children to carry on to the next generation. And it was said that Elizabeth Mary was the favourite daughter of John Batman, and the 2 sons that survived her were Alfred Lewis Weir and Austin Batman Weir. And Alfred Lewis Weir died in 1885, so Austin Batman Weir was the only surviving grandson. The fifth daughter, Ellen Gray Batman, was born on the 10th of April 1831 at Kingston in Tasmania, and she died aged only 20 in Melbourne in April 1851. The sixth child, Adelaide May Batman, was born at Kingston in Tasmania on the 21st of August 1832, and she died in Scotland on the 25th of May 1882, aged 50. The seventh daughter, Pellemina Frances Darling Batman, was born on the 11th of July 1834 at Kingston in Tasmania, and she married Dr. Daniel Bunce on the 24th of March 1851 in Victoria at the age of 16. Daniel was 39. They had 2 children, Adelaide Eliza, who was born in 1853, who died at the age of 1, and then another stillborn child, a girl, born in 1858. Daniel Bunce was at one time the curator of the Geelong Botanical Gardens, and he was the author of several known works and a friend of Leichhardt the explorer. And Pellemina died on the 15th of August 1859 in Geelong. Their only son and the youngest child, John Charles Batman, was born on the 5th of May 1836 in Melbourne. He was the second recorded birth in Victoria, and he died aged only 8 on the 11th of January 1845. There was an article on the 17th of January outlining his death. On Saturday afternoon, a melancholy accident occurred at the Falls at the Queen's Wharf, which terminated in the death by drowning of John Charles Batman, the only son and heir-at-law of the late Mr. Batman and defendant in the equity suit Batman versus Lonsdale and others, which has been so long pending in the Supreme Court. It seems the child was with his sister playing at the Falls, and not being willing to return home when she wished, she threatened to leave him and tell his mama of his disobedience. The little girl then ran from her brother a little distance, and on looking around to see whether he was following, she saw her brother, who had most probably stumbled in, attempting to run after his sister and struggling in the water and being rapidly taken away by the current. Her screams brought several of the Aborigines to the spot, but before anything could be done for the assistance of the child, he sunk and was drowned. Strenuous exertions were made for the recovery of the body, but without effect that evening. Yesterday morning at 10:30, the body was found by one of the Aborigines near the south bank of the basin, about 12 yards below the falls. So really quite a tragic story for the family. From all of the children, the 8 children that they had, in the end, they had very few descendants. And for Eliza Callaghan, she met an awful death after having such a promising start when she had met John Batman and him being her saviour.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes